If you're a game master, creating proper pacing in your tabletop role-playing game is of critical importance. Good pacing is the thing that takes a so-so game and turns it into a great game. What is pacing? Before we can discuss how to create good pacing, we should probably define it. And to define it, we need to ask ourselves what the foundation of all tabletop RPGs is. And the answer to that is meaningful choices. The sentence I repeat the most at all of my games is perhaps, what would you like to do? And then my players tell me, I adjudicate, and then we repeat. Like last night in a game, I was literally asking over and over again, what would you like to do? What would you like to do? What would you like to do? They were in a bit of an indecision loop. But our games are essentially a string of me asking my players what they want to do, them telling me, and then me resolving what happens based on dice rolls. However, the choices must be meaningful. If they're traveling down a road and heading to a dungeon and I say, okay, you've traveled 5 minutes, what would you like to do? My players are going to say that they keep on going down the road. I mean, what else would they do? Now, if I ask them after every 5 minutes of in-game travel what they want to do, it gets rather silly and pointless. Why? Because there is no meaningful choice. Now contrast that with this. You travel down the road for a couple hours and then hear a scream off in the distance. It sounds like it's coming from the tree line. What do you do? Now see, that is a meaningful choice because something is clearly afoot. My players may fall for my very obvious side quest plot hook, or they may decide to keep traveling. The choice is theirs, and the decision they make is important and will influence future events. So an RPG must consist of meaningful choices. And if you've ever been in a game that seems slow or boring, chances are good that there weren't enough meaningful choices, which means there was too much dead space or time between those choices. And now we're starting to get at the heart of pacing, removing as much of that dead space between meaningful choices as possible. One of the reasons that location-based adventures, usually simply referred to as dungeons, even though they can take place anywhere, are such an effective tool in tabletop RPGs. Almost every choice in a dungeon is a meaningful one. Opening the door, checking the chest for traps, inspecting the fireplace, brokering a truce between the goblins, or deciding to attack. Gameplay in a dungeon is packed with meaningful choices. I mean, there is a reason that 90% of my games take place in dungeons. I love a good old-fashioned dungeon. They're so much fun. And they're fun because they are filled with meaningful choices. Removing the dead space. Okay, so we know we want to remove this dead space between meaningful choices, but how do we do that? First, let's mention that a scene is the game mechanic by which meaningful choices are typically delivered. For instance, above I set the scene of the party traveling to a dungeon, but then hearing a scream from the tree line. To remove the dead space, you essentially just skip from scene to scene, meaningful choice to meaningful choice. Okay, they heard a scream from the tree line. That was the meaningful choice. And the players decided to go investigate. So I say, you walk over to the tree line. Give me perception checks. And notice 3 figures dragging off a woman and a man. What do you do? And right there is the next scene that delivers the next meaningful choice. If they said that they were going to investigate the tree line and I got them half of the way there and there was still nothing interesting and no choice to be made, and I was like, what do you do? They're gonna be like, we go to the tree line, game master, like what we said. Now hurry up, get us there faster. You see, you don't want that dead space. You want to skip right to the next meaningful choice. And what we're doing as well when removing dead space is threefold. First, you identify the intention of the players. They want to travel to the dungeon. Second, you determine the obstacles they may encounter and present a meaningful choice. A scream from the tree line. Then you rinse and repeat. Intention, choice. Intention, choice. This may seem brain-numbingly simple, and it kind of is. The trick is to not lollygag and not burden your game with unnecessary fluff that is of little interest to the players and has nothing to do with resolving the current scene or getting them to the next one. And in this context, each scene must have a meaningful choice. Here is a classic example of bad pacing and a horrible scene. I was once a player in a group and we were traveling somewhere. Well, the game master had us spend about 30 minutes working out and role-playing how we were going to cross a river. Well, there was a druid who could shape change into a turtle, so it's like a big massive tortoise. So getting across was trivial. But we had to play out round by round who went across the river first, who was left on the one bank, who was on the other bank, who was in the middle on the turtle's back, all that sort of thing. And for what, you might ask? Did we get attacked while split up on the different sides of the river? Nope. Nothing. We just had to roleplay crossing the river. So what was the problem with that scene, you may ask? I mean, it's a role-playing game. You're role-playing what your characters are doing to go across the river. Like, why is there a problem with that, Luke? Because there was no meaningful choice. Like, there was no meaningful choice. How we decided to go across the river had zero impact on the results of the game. It was a pointless waste of time. It was a done deal. There was no rolls to slip off the turtle's back. There were no enemies popping up out of the water. There was no current that was going to push us astray and possibly dump us and send us over a waterfall. There were no hazards. There were no dangers. There was no challenge. It was completely meaningless. It was a pointless exercise of role-playing this scenario. And why? It felt like a complete waste of time because it was. Somebody's gonna get upset and be like, but Luke, that's what the game is all about. And I'll be like, all right, you play your game, I'll play my game, because that is boring crap. I want meaningful choices. I want consequences. I want there to be a drama, tension. Give me these classic elements. You watch a movie of that kind of thing where they're just spending a half an hour crossing a river, and you know what? You're gonna stop watching that movie. You're gonna go somewhere else. Next, we're going to hit on 4 different kinds of time that you can use to control pacing in your games. But really quick, I want to let you know that if you missed our last Kickstarter, The Secret Art of Game Mastery, pre-orders are still available for a limited time. If you pick up the 3-book collection, you'll be getting over 250 pages of Game Master advice and pro tips from me and my team, over 400 pages of templates and guidance as you prepare your campaign and adventures, and then over 400 pages of templates and direction for running your games. General advice, preparation guidance, and running your game guidance. Both hardcovers and special edition leather covers are available, and you can even get a cool customizable Game Master screen. There's a link down below if you are interested. On using time for pacing. In essence, the concept of pacing is based on how you use time in a campaign. There are a few different kinds of time in tabletop RPGs that help you, the Game Master, control pacing at your table. The first one is something that we call now time. This is being in the moment. This is when real time is progressing at the same pace as in-game time. Most of a game session is usually played this way. The turtle crossing the river scenario, that was now time. We were literally playing out in real time, crossing that river and going across. That's part of what made it painful. And then you have what we call slow time. Everything slows down when something important or meaningful is happening, such as when a player has to make an important decision or a meaningful combat is taking place. The narration of events in slow time take longer to resolve in real time than it takes for the characters to experience it in the game. Combats are the perfect example of this. And then we have what we call abstract or fast time. This sort of time applies when things that aren't super important are happening. Turtle crossing a river. And the Game Master can resolve them with some narration, or the players can quickly get it done faster in real time than it would take in game time. Shopping for supplies is a classic example of this. What might take you a day or two, you can resolve in like a half an hour. Or what might take you a half an hour to cross a river, you can resolve in a few moments as the Game Master says, you cross the river. See how easy that was? And then we could have gotten to the dragon fight or something cool instead of spending a half an hour crossing a river. Does it seem like still a little jaded over this event? It's such a classic example of bad game design and bad way to run your... Okay, yep, moving on. And the last type of time is what we call a sharp cut. This time and pacing technique is used when things are meaningless overall, such as walking down an empty hallway or traveling across a safe town to go to the general store and get supplies, or crossing a river on a turtle. With sharp cuts, the Game Master quickly narrates the party to the next scene where a meaningful choice is made. Large gaps of time may be skipped very quickly. Like if you had to cross a river on the back of a turtle, you could just sharp cut over that and put us in front of the dragon that we're going to fight or parlay with or run from our lives for our lives. But it's a meaningful choice at least. I really gotta calm down. As I said, these forms of time allow you to control pacing in your games, and generally speaking, this is when you use them. When you are seeking to remove dead space, you'll use abstract time or sharp cuts. When the characters are interacting with the majority of their scenes, you'll use now time. And when the characters are interacting with a scene that is super important and filled with meaningful choices, you'll use slow time. On player preferences. But there is more to good pacing than focusing on cutting out the dead space between meaningful choices. You also want to consider player preferences. First of all, adventure pacing is highly dependent on the types of players that you have. Consider what your players like when they're running in the adventure and playing the adventure, and design your adventures around that, but also use time that emphasizes the things they find important, that would be like slow time, and de-emphasizes the parts of an adventure that they find uninteresting, and that's when you're going to use a sharp cut, or you're going to use abstract or fast time. And campaign pacing at the overall level is even more dependent on player preferences. Players want their choices to feel meaningful, and when a scene or an encounter focuses on something they care about, it becomes meaningful, so slow things down. Understanding your players is the biggest key to campaign pacing. Now we're going to talk about a little bit of research that was done back in the day that delves into this topic a little bit more. I'm not going to go into super fine details on this, but you can look it up and figure out more if you'd like to. But in 1996, game researcher Richard Bartle divided players into 4 types based on their primary motivation. The first type was killers. They had like a little grid where it was like a chart like this, and then you could fall into one of the 4 quadrants. And there were 2 axes. One axis was player focused or world focused, which you preferred more. And then there was another axis that was prefers to act or prefers to interact. Do things or interact with things. And so they basically charted 4 quadrants, and these are the basic 4 types of players. This is one way of looking at it. I know that there have been other studies on different types of players as well. But anyway, killers were player focused, and they preferred to act. They were most interested in themselves as a player, their own character, and they wanted to do stuff. They wanted to do things. Achievers were world focused. They cared less about their own character perhaps and more about the world, and they also preferred to act. Socializers are player focused, so they care about their character, again, themselves, but they prefer to interact with others in the world, other people, other things, other little things you can poke at in the game world. And the last type was explorers. They are world focused, and they prefer to interact with that world. I guess the socializers wanted, they were player focused and they prefer to interact. They're probably interacting with themselves, with the other players or NPCs in the game world. Yeah, see, I did my research kind of, but you know, it's not perfect. So just go look it up and stop yelling at me in the comments already. Anyway, the Bartle test determines where a player falls within these categories and can help a game master design and pace their game based on campaign pillars, which focus the scenes, encounters, and adventures around what players enjoy the most. However, whether or not you use that tool itself, which is linked down below in the campaign pillars article, the main point here is that you want to build your game around your players' preferences. When you fill your scenes with meaningful choices that you know will appeal to your players, it makes the pacing all that much better because your players will care more about what is happening. And in turn, this amps up their excitement and paces out the campaign to their satisfaction. Make sure, of course, that the game consists of things that appeal to you, the game master, too. This is non-negotiable. No game master should ever be cursed with running a game that they don't enjoy. And by the way, that whole Bartle test stuff, I found that in our research for this video. I don't use that myself. I know more or less the things my players enjoy, and I put those types of things in the game. I don't use any super special fancy research. I just use this in my experience, so you're welcome to use whatever you find most useful for you. Just kind of throwing that out there as one thing you might consider. By the way, if you're finding this information useful, please give me a thumbs up and share this video with others. One of the best ways you can help other game masters is by sharing helpful content. And if you're like a player and you want to share this with your game master because they have no idea how to do pacing, or they're doing things like making you cross rivers on turtles for like a half an hour and it's boring as crap, you can share this video with them too. They won't mind, and they might. Using your campaign pillars. You may have heard of the 3 pillars of a role-playing game: combat, exploration, and social interaction. But while those are relevant, that's not exactly what we're talking about here. Instead, what you want to do is establish special campaign pillars. And these are the things, these campaign pillars are what you're going to build your campaign, adventures, and encounters around. For instance, let's say you know that your players love challenging tactical combat. traps, political maneuverings, and interacting with new and interesting NPCs. With all of that information, you would seek to do the following. I think I preemptively put my number 1 out. We're gonna just retract that back in. Number 1, try to include at least 1 or 2 of your pillars in each game session. And number 2, when you use a pillar, especially if it's something that all of your players enjoy, bring down the pace of play to focus on it and make it more memorable. This is a slow time. You know, the 4 different types of time. You're gonna use slow time for this. Don't be a stickler on making sure everything moves in real time in these situations. Allow game time to slow down so players can savor the moment. And number 3, build that encounter up. Intensify it with a twist, a major threat, or something meaningful to a player's backstory. Number 4. Number 4. Pillars need to have a reason for happening. They need to be intentional and have meaning to 1 or more players. And number 5, don't focus as heavily on non-pillar moments. Things that players don't care about as much during the game, crossing a river on a turtle. Those moments create dead space. For example, your players probably don't care about how they get to the new NPC, so don't describe every street, turn, and carriage along the way. Burn through the negative space and get to the stuff your players really care about. These are the moments to speed up the game time and narrate with that time being skipped. This is when you're going to use abstract time or a sharp cut. And number 6, when you're prepping the game, focus on the pillars, not on the dead space. Other things that help pacing. The number 3 is a key number in making something memorable to a person. It's baked into human psychology. I don't know why. We have 10 fingers, 5 in one hand, but for whatever reason, 3 is special. Repeating something 3 times makes it memorable. When describing a scene, use at least 3 of the 5 senses. I want to see scenes described with taste, like, you know, when you walk into the room, you taste the dirt. And it's delicious. Taste usually doesn't work too well, so you're stuck with 4, but do the best you... If you could describe... Taking it one adventure and every scene you describe the taste of something, that would be interesting. Okay, and also, when describing a location, focus on 3 important things that the players can see or interact with. Include minor scene dressing to fill the frame, but there should only be 3 main focal points. You ever been in a game where they like describe to you a room and like the description just keeps going and going and going and going and going, and at the end of listening to it, you don't remember almost any of it, and you're just like, crap, what do we do with that? And then there's that one player who's like, could you repeat that? And then you go through it all again. Yeah, super long descriptions are super helpful a lot of times. If you give 3 focal points, that's much more meaningful, much more helpful for the game. Keep the game moving. Social interaction between players is fine and great unless the rest of the table is starting to get restless. Planning sessions need to have a time limit. This is when you're all around the table trying to decide what you're going to do next or how to get into the castle, and it's like time is passing and you're starting to go around in circles and like no decision is being made. That's your typical Dungeons and Dragons planning session. Who's been in those before? Anyway, they gotta have a time limit, otherwise they're gonna turn into analysis paralysis and bring the game to a screeching halt and destroy pacing completely. Also, shopping sessions are fun for very few players, so it's important to make sure they don't bog anything down. And this is the time in the video where I get like people commenting saying, Luke, I love shopping sessions. That's the most fun part of Dungeons and Dragons is buying cool stuff. If that's what you enjoy, that's cool. You might be in the minority, but that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just not gonna spend hours shopping. I want to kill things. Luke, that's the difference between you and me. Like, I enjoyed the mundane things and like shopping, and you want to go kill things. You're like a bloody murderer. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, look, anybody who has had their wife take them to Kohl's for hours on end and go shopping will understand why I don't like shopping in my role-playing games. Like, I have to do that enough in real life, don't you understand? Okay, moving on. Another thing that's gonna help with pacing is to enable the players to help create and maintain the pace themselves. Proactive players can generate momentum. Don't inhibit that because of what you have planned. Like, an example of a proactive player is the player who goes and kicks open the door and gets into the next room and gets the next scene moving. The player who's like, there's decision paralysis happening and they're just like, you go open the door. No! Yeah, but the game keeps on moving. I love players like that. And you can also ask your players if there is some personal quest or objective they'd like to pursue in the current and future game sessions. Give them some meaningful choices that they choose, and they're even more meaningful. And you can also poll the players from time to time to get their input on how things are going, and of course adjust as necessary and desired. Things to avoid. The number one thing is interruptions and obstacles to the game. These are absolute pace killers. For instance, it's okay to take breaks, but those breaks should come before or after pillar scenes, never in the middle of one. And sometimes there's conversations at the table, like the other day, my players were talking about some awesome character builds they were super excited about, but it was completely interrupting the flow of the game and the pacing of the moment that we were in, and yeah. The other thing that could kill pacing is trying to force it. The Game Master should plan for pacing, but just like anything else, trying to railroad players into the moment isn't going to help. So I politely waited for my player to kind of finish up their talk about this character build they were excited about, and then I cut in there and got everybody back on track. You don't want to be rude and mean, right? I mean, people are just there to have fun and chill. You can't be like this whip master, slave master with the whip. It's not what we're doing around here, right? Somebody's gonna get upset about that comment. I'm gonna get flamed on Twitter for that. Another thing that can hurt pacing is skipping something that is meaningful or important to one of your players just because it isn't important to you as the game master. This is where knowing your players really matters. And this is like something you'd be like, Luke, I'm one of your players and I enjoy shopping. You should give us an entire session of shopping. I think I would quit. You know what I would do? I would be like, you know what? I'm gonna sit this game session out. You guys go shopping. I'll see you at the next game session. By the way, when my team and I were doing the research for this video, we found a couple really good articles on the topic that I'm going to link down below, both to give credit for where we got some of this information from, and in case you'd like to do some further reading on your own. Now, if you have any tips and suggestions about pacing you'd like to share, please let us know down in the comments. Also, don't forget to pre-order The Secret Art of Game Mastery at the link below. Now, if you'd like to learn about 15 Dungeon Master myths and the actual truth about dungeon mastering, click right here. And until next time, happy game mastering.